The major's hand trembled as he set down the satellite phone. Outside the temporary command post in eastern Syria, dust swirled through the cooling evening air, painting everything the color of dried blood. He just received confirmation that Viper 11, the A-10 Thunderbolt II that had been providing close air support for the past 6 hours, had taken catastrophic damage. The pilot had gone silent mid-transmission. Search and rescue reported no parachute, no beacon, no hope. Major Reeves walked to the plywood wall where someone had taped a mission roster, his finger tracing down to the name. Captain Mikhail Redline Voronov, 28 years old, 2 combat tour, a wife in Germany. The major closed his eyes and felt the weight of another notification letter forming in his mind. But 3 kilometers south, something impossible was happening. The A-10 shouldn't have been flying. Its right engine was shredded, trailing black smoke like a funeral shroud across the darkening sky. Hydraulic fluid streamed from punctured lines, painting arterial patterns along the fuselage. The entire right stabilizer had been nearly severed by a surface-to-air missile fragment, hanging on by cables and prayers. Inside the cockpit, the pilot's oxygen mask fogged with each measured breath, hands moving across controls with surgical precision, despite the chaos of alarms screaming for attention. The radio had been destroyed in the hit. No way to call for help, no way to tell anyone she was still alive. Captain Lyra Dust Cowery adjusted her grip on the stick, feeling the aircraft buck and shudder beneath her like a dying animal refusing to yield. Her left shoulder throbbed where shrapnel had punched through the canopy, and she could taste copper in her mouth, though whether from biting her tongue during the evasive maneuver or something worse, she couldn't tell. The heads-up display flickered, died, then stuttered back to life, showing information she already knew. She was flying a $30 million titanium bathtub that barely responded to inputs, with one engine producing maybe 60% thrust, over hostile territory, with no communications and the sun setting fast. She should eject. Every procedure, every training scenario, every senior pilot who'd ever lectured her about calculated risk versus stupid pride said the same thing. Punch out, take your chances with the ejection seat, let the aircraft become another smoking crater in the Syrian desert. But Lyra's dark eyes, reflecting the amber glow of warning lights, stayed fixed on the horizon. 23 kilometers ahead, marked on her kneeboard chart with coordinates she'd memorized, was the forward operating base where Major Reeves sat writing her off as another statistic. Where Viper 12, Captain Redline Voronov, had landed safely 30 minutes ago. Where the entire ground team she'd covered for the last 6 hours waited for extraction, surrounded by hostiles who'd just proven they had working SAM systems. Ejecting meant leaving them without air cover, without the GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon slung beneath her dying jet, without the psychological terror that an A-10, even a crippled one, could bring to enemy forces. The decision wasn't heroic. Lyra had learned long ago that heroism was usually just stubbornness with better PR. She wasn't staying airborne to prove anything or chase glory. She was staying up because the math was simple and cold. If she went down here in hostile territory, they'd have to risk search and rescue assets to find her. More people in danger, more chaos, more variables she couldn't control. Better to fly the broken bird home and let gravity decide later. She nudged the stick left, feeling the aircraft respond with agonizing slowness, and began a shallow turn toward the base. The right engine coughed, missing like a car on its last legs, and she whispered something her grandmother used to say in Arabic, a prayer or a curse. She'd never been quite sure which. The A-10's designers had built it to take punishment, to absorb damage that would down any other aircraft and keep flying. They'd armored the cockpit with titanium, protected the hydraulics with redundancy, separated the engines so one could fail without dooming the aircraft. But even the engineers at Fairchild Republic hadn't imagined something like this. A jet held together by determination, and the stubborn refusal of one pilot to accept that impossible meant anything. As darkness gathered and the first stars appeared above the war zone, the major received a radio call that made him drop his coffee mug. The tower operator's voice carried confusion and disbelief. They had a radar contact, low and slow, trailing the signature of one engine, approaching from the south. Viper 11 was still flying. The flight line fell silent when the tower made the announcement. Maintenance crews stopped mid-task, tools hanging forgotten in their hands. Ground personnel emerged from tents and prefabs, shielding their eyes against the sunset glare, searching the southern sky for something none of them really believed would appear. Redline, still in his flight suit with sweat stains mapping the intensity of his own close call, stood beside his relatively undamaged, and stared at the horizon with an expression somewhere between awe and dread. He'd heard the SAM launch warning, heard Dusk call out evasive maneuvers in that calm, almost detached voice she used when things got critical. Then he'd heard the explosion, muffled by distance but unmistakable, followed by her transmission cutting to static. In the seconds that followed, as he jinked and dove and put his own aircraft through punishing GS to avoid the same fate, he'd assumed she was gone. Everyone had assumed. The silence on the radio confirmed it. Search and rescue confirmed it. The major's face, when Redline landed, confirmed it. But the radar didn't lie. Major Reeves climbed onto the roof of the command post, binoculars pressed to his eyes, scanning the darkening southern quadrant where the contact was supposed to be. His jaw worked silently, grinding through possibilities and probabilities, trying to reconcile what the tower was telling him with what every instinct said was impossible. Beside him, the air operations officer, a graying lieutenant colonel named Marsh who'd flown F-16s over Baghdad in 2003, made a sound low in his throat. "There," Marsh said quietly, pointing. At first it looked like a bird, or maybe a trick of the fading light playing across the mountains. Then the shape resolved. An A-10, lower than any aircraft should be, trailing a ribbon of smoke so thick it looked solid, like the jet was dragging the sky behind it. It wasn't flying so much as falling forward, trading altitude for distance in a desperate equation only the pilot could calculate. The tower erupted in chatter. Emergency crews scrambled, fire trucks racing toward the runway with lights painting the evening red. The medical team prepped the trauma bay, uncertain if they'd need to treat a pilot or recover remains. Nobody knew what condition the aircraft was in, what condition the pilot was in, only that somehow, impossibly, Viper 11 had refused to die. Lyra saw the runway lights come up, a string of pearls in the gathering dark, and felt something in her chest loosen slightly. She'd made it. Broken, bleeding, flying an aircraft that should have been scattered across 20 kilometers of desert, but she'd made it. The hard part, perversely, was about to begin. Landing. The A-10 had crude but effective manual reversion systems, allowing pilots to control the aircraft even with complete hydraulic failure using pure cable and muscle. She'd practiced it in simulators, in controlled environments with safety officers watching and emergency procedures briefed and debriefed until they were automatic. But simulation couldn't replicate the sluggish response of controls damaged by shrapnel, couldn't duplicate the way the aircraft wanted to roll right constantly, forcing her to hold pressure on the stick that made her wounded shoulder scream. Couldn't prepare her for the knowledge that she was coming in on one engine, with barely functional ailerons, and that the runway was short enough that precision mattered more than pride. The tower cleared the frequency, giving her priority and silence. Every ear on base tuned to the single guard frequency, waiting for her voice. But Lyra's radio was still dead, smashed by the same fragment that had torn through her shoulder. She had no way to tell them her status, no way to coordinate, no way to let them know if she was injured or if the aircraft was controllable or if she planned to eject at the last second. All they could do was watch and prepare for whatever happened next. She lined up on final approach, the runway stretching ahead like a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. The right engine coughed again, RPMs fluctuating wildly, and she made minute adjustments to the throttle with touch so gentle it might have been a caress. The aircraft bucked in a crosswind, nearly rolling past the point where she could recover, and she brought it back with sheer force of will transmitted through her hands into the controls. Redline watched from beside his A-10, and despite years of training that taught pilots to remain professionally detached, his fists were clenched so tight his knuckles had gone white. He'd flown with Dust for 18 months, had seen her thread bombs through windows in precision strikes, had watched her walk away from paperwork disasters and bureaucratic nightmares with the same calm she brought to combat. But this was different. This was physics and luck in a cage match, with her caught between them. The A-10 dropped toward the runway like a stone learning to fly. At 200 feet, it rolled hard right and Lyra caught it, muscles burning with the effort of keeping wings level with controls that responded like they were moving through concrete. At 100 feet, the working engine missed, sputtered, caught again. At 50 feet, she pulled back gently on the stick, trying to flare, trying to transition from controlled fall to controlled landing. The main gear touched first, surprisingly gentle, a kiss against concrete. Then the nose gear, and suddenly the aircraft was rolling, decelerating, still alive and on the ground. Lyra's hands didn't relax on the controls until the A-10 had slowed to walking pace, and she'd turned off onto a taxiway where emergency vehicles waited with lights spinning in the darkness. Only then, as she brought the dying jet to a complete stop and pulled the remaining throttle to idle, did she let her head fall back against the seat and close her eyes. The canopy was stuck, damaged hydraulics refusing to open it. Fire crews surrounded the aircraft immediately, working to manually crank the heavy transparency up. When it finally rose, revealing the cockpit interior, the first responders saw blood on the instrument panel, on the stick, on the pilot's flight suit. They saw the shredded right side of the canopy where shrapnel had entered like angry hornets. They saw Captain Lyra Cowery, 31 years old, Lebanese-American, 5'5" and 130 pounds soaking wet, sitting in the pilot's seat with her left shoulder torn and her face pale under the oxygen mask. She pulled off the mask slowly, carefully, like every movement cost something. Her voice, when she spoke, was rough with stress and dehydration, but carried the same calm detachment it always did. Aircraft will need extensive repair. Recommend complete engine and control system inspection. Possible frame damage starboard side. I'm good to debrief after medical. The paramedic, a staff sergeant who'd seen plenty of combat injuries, shook his head. Ma'am, you're going to medical now. Debrief can wait. For a moment, something flickered in Lyra's dark eyes. Something that might have been amusement or exhaustion or the last threads of adrenaline finally unwinding. She tried to climb out of the cockpit, got one leg over the rail before her injured shoulder gave out and she nearly fell. 3 sets of hands caught her, guided her down, and she allowed it with the resignation of someone who'd fought enough battles for one day. Major Reeves arrived as they were loading her onto the stretcher. He stood beside the ruined A-10, hand resting on the fuselage near where the GAU-8 cannon jutted like a defiant middle finger to gravity and good sense. The aircraft was a horror show up close, metal peeled back, systems exposed, hydraulic fluid and oil and fuel staining everything. That this machine had flown at all was remarkable. That someone had landed it bordered on miraculous. "Captain," he said quietly as the stretcher passed him. Lyra's eyes opened, focused on him with effort. "Sir." "That was," he paused, searching for words adequate to the moment and finding nothing sufficient. "That was the finest display of airmanship I've witnessed in 23 years." She smiled just slightly, and it transformed her face from pale and exhausted to something almost mischievous. "The Major said it was over," she whispered. "Figured I should make him a liar, sir." Then they were carrying her away toward the medical tent, and Reeves was left standing beside an aircraft that shouldn't have made it home with a pilot who'd refused to accept reality's verdict. Around him, the flight line remained silent, everyone processing what they'd witnessed, trying to fit it into their understanding of what was possible. Redline approached slowly, still in his flight suit, and stood beside the Major. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Redline reached out and touched the damaged fuselage, fingers tracing the jagged edge of shrapnel damage. "She covered my egress," he said quietly. "The SAM site had me locked. She drew their fire deliberately, gave me time to get out of range. This," he gestured at the damage, "this was supposed to hit me." The Major looked at the younger pilot and saw the weight of understanding settling onto his shoulders. The knowledge that Lyra had made a choice, calculated and cold, to put herself in danger so another pilot could make it home. Not heroism, but calculus. The same math she'd used to justify flying the broken aircraft back instead of ejecting. "The call sign," Reeves said. "Dust, you know where it came from?" Redline shook his head. "Lebanon. She grew up in Beirut during the Civil War aftermath. When she was 7, her neighborhood got hit by artillery. Buildings came down. She spent 6 hours under rubble waiting for rescue, breathing concrete dust, convinced she was going to die buried in the ruins of home. When they pulled her out, she was covered head to toe in gray powder. Her grandmother said she looked like a ghost, like dust given shape. The name stuck, but she reclaimed it, made it mean something else. Made it mean she's hard to kill, hard to pin down, always rising from ruins that should have buried her." In the medical tent, under fluorescent lights that made her skin look even paler, Lyra let the doctors work. The shoulder wound was worse than she'd thought, shrapnel embedded deep but nothing that wouldn't heal. Cuts and bruises elsewhere, mild concussion from the hard landing, dehydration and exhaustion. They wanted to keep her overnight for observation. She didn't argue. The adrenaline had fully crashed now, leaving her feeling hollowed out and distant from her own body. A nurse adjusted the IV drip and offered a sympathetic smile. "You had everyone scared out there. Hell of a flying, Captain." "Hell of a jet," Lyra corrected quietly. "The Warthog took the damage. I just pointed it in the right direction." But that was deflection, and they both knew it. The A-10 was an incredible machine, designed to absorb punishment and keep fighting. But machines didn't make decisions. They didn't calculate risk and choose to stay airborne over hostile territory with 1,000 good reasons to eject. They didn't drag themselves home on failing systems through sheer stubborn refusal to quit. That was all pilot. Outside, the maintenance crews had begun their assessment of Viper 11. Flashlights played across damaged sections, revealing the full extent of what the aircraft had endured. The SAM fragment had hit the right engine cowling at a glancing angle, destroying the engine and sending shrapnel through hydraulic lines, control cables, and fuel systems. By every reasonable metric, the aircraft should have exploded. That it had merely caught fire, that the fire suppression systems had actually worked, that enough redundant controls remained functional to allow controlled flight, added up to luck so improbable it felt orchestrated. But the maintenance chief, a master sergeant named Kovacs who'd been working on A-10 since before Lyra learned to drive, saw something else. He saw control inputs that had been carefully managed to minimize stress on damaged systems. He saw evidence of a pilot who understood her aircraft's tolerances and had flown right up to those limits without exceeding them. He saw genius in the shallow approach angle, in the gentle touchdown that had minimized landing stress, in the way the aircraft had been positioned to stop near emergency equipment despite no radio contact. "She flew it like it was made of glass," he said to his assistant, a young airman who was still staring at the damage with wide eyes. "Kept it together through pure skill. I've seen pilots destroy perfectly good aircraft through bad technique. She brought this one home when it had every right to disintegrate." In the command post, Major Reeves typed his after-action report with unusual care, choosing words precisely. He'd written too many reports in his career, documented too many missions that blurred together into a haze of operational details and tactical outcomes. This one felt different. This one demanded precision because people would read it and make judgments, draw conclusions about what had happened in the sky over Syria. He wrote about the SAM site, about the coordinated ground attack his team had been executing, about the close air support mission that had been routine until it wasn't. He documented Redline's near miss, the successful evasion, the radio silence from Viper 11. Then he wrote about the impossible return, the emergency landing, the aircraft damage. But he also wrote about something harder to quantify, the intangible quality that separated adequate pilots from exceptional ones, the judgment to know when rules could be broken and when they were sacred, the skill to execute maneuvers at the edge of possible, the courage to accept responsibility for decisions that could easily have resulted in death. Captain Lyra Cowery, he wrote, displayed airmanship and tactical acumen consistent with the highest traditions of military aviation. Her actions resulted in mission success, protection of ground forces, and preservation of valuable aircraft assets against overwhelming odds. Recommend consideration for appropriate recognition. It was understated, deliberately so. The full story would emerge in debriefs and investigations, in maintenance reports and flight data recovery if the recorder had survived. Right now, tonight, with the aircraft cooling on the taxiway and the pilot sleeping off painkillers in medical, he wanted the initial record to be clean and professional. Others would add the mythology later. Word spread through the base with the speed of wildfire through dry grass. By midnight, everyone knew some version of the story. The details varied, growing more elaborate with each retelling, but the core remained constant. Dust had flown a dying A-10 home through skill and stubbornness, had refused to abandon her aircraft or her mission, had put herself in danger to protect another pilot. In the enlisted quarters, young airmen debated whether they'd have had the courage to stay with the aircraft. In the officer club, senior pilots nursed drinks and remembered their own close calls, their own moments where luck and skill had combined to cheat death. On the flight line, maintenance crews worked through the night on other aircraft, but kept glancing over at Viper 11 like it was a memorial or a shrine. Redline couldn't sleep. He lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling, replaying the mission in his mind. The part where the SAM warning had lit up his display. The part where he'd broken hard left, pulling GS that grayed his vision. The part where Dust's voice had crackled over the radio, calm and detached. Viper 12, break right, egress on heading 090. I'll handle cleanup. He'd broken right, followed orders, gotten clear while she drew fire. Standard tactics for mutual support in an A-10 flight. One aircraft suppresses threats while the other evades or attacks. They'd practiced it 100 times, but practice didn't prepare you for the moment when your wingman's aircraft took the hit meant for you, when their engine exploded in flames while you flew away clean. Survivor's guilt was unprofessional, but it crept in anyway. The knowledge that her damage, her injury, her close brush with death had bought his safety. That calculation sat heavy in his chest, making sleep impossible. In medical, Lyra dreamed about concrete dust and darkness. Old memories from Beirut mixed with recent terror from Syria, creating a confused narrative where she was simultaneously 7 years old trapped under rubble and 31 years old trapped in a dying aircraft. Both times she'd survived by staying calm, by working the problem methodically, by refusing to panic when panic was the most natural response. Her grandmother's voice echoed through the dream, speaking in Arabic, saying something about dust settling but never truly disappearing, about how the smallest particles could travel furthest on the wind, could survive when larger pieces crumbled. It was the kind of metaphorical wisdom her grandmother specialized in, profound and slightly confusing in equal measure. When Lyra woke in the gray hours before dawn, her shoulder throbbing despite painkillers, she found Redline sitting in a chair beside her bed. He looked exhausted, still in his flight suit, eyes shadowed with something darker than simple fatigue. "You should be sleeping," she said quietly. "So should you." He leaned forward, elbows on knees. "I wanted to say, I know you were just executing mutual support tactics, but you feel guilty," Lyra finished. "Because I took damage protecting you, because I made it home barely alive while you landed clean." Redline nodded slowly. Don't. She adjusted herself carefully, wincing as the movement pulled at stitches. You would have done the same for me. You have done the same, that's the job, that's why we fly with wingmen. Next time positions might be reversed. You'll be the one drawing fire while I egress. That's how it works. Will there be a next time? He gestured at her injured shoulder. Medical might ground you. Lyra's smile was sharp enough to cut. Let them try. But both of them knew it wasn't that simple. Combat aviation demanded perfect physical condition, complete trust in your body's ability to execute under stress. An injured shoulder might heal completely, or it might leave weakness, limited mobility, reduced reaction time. The flight surgeons would make their assessment based on metrics and measurements, not on desire or determination. The possibility that she might never fly combat again hung unspoken between them. As dawn broke over Syria, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber, the investigation began. Flight data recovery teams descended on Viper 11 with equipment designed to extract every piece of information the aircraft's systems had recorded. They wanted telemetry data, performance metrics, sequence of events. They wanted to understand how the aircraft had survived, what systems had failed and in what order, how the pilot had compensated for cascading damage. The aircraft's data recorder had survived, miraculously intact despite the violence of the SAM hit. When they pulled the data and began analysis, the picture that emerged was simultaneously terrifying and inspiring. The SAM fragment had struck with enough force to destroy the right engine instantly, severing hydraulic lines and control cables in a fraction of a second. The aircraft should have entered an uncontrollable roll. Instead, the data showed immediate corrective inputs, adjustments happening faster than conscious thought should allow, as if the pilot and aircraft were connected by something deeper than mechanical controls. The engineer analyzing the data, a civilian contractor named Chen who designed flight control systems before joining the investigation team, stared at the screen with professional fascination. She flew it on manual reversion with partial control authority, he said to his colleague. Look at these stick inputs. She's compensating for the roll tendency constantly, making micro-adjustments dozens of times per second. The workload must have been immense. His colleague, a former Air Force test pilot named Morrison, pulled up the altitude and airspeed data. And she did it for 23 kilometers, maintained controlled flight through combat maneuvering, terrain following, and an approach to landing. With a wounded shoulder, no communications, and one engine. That's not just skill, that's exceptional. They compiled their findings into a technical report that stripped away emotion and focused on measurable facts. Control inputs, system responses, performance metrics. But even reduced to numbers and graphs, the story remained remarkable. The human element, the pilot's judgment and ability, shone through the data like gold in rock. Major Reeves received the preliminary report at breakfast, reading it while his coffee went cold. He'd flown A-10s for 15 years before moving into command roles, had logged thousands of hours in the cockpit, considered himself intimately familiar with the aircraft's capabilities. But the data showed performance at the very edge of the flight envelope, maneuvers he wasn't sure he could have executed even under ideal conditions. The final paragraph of the report carried a recommendation. The pilot's actions warrant detailed analysis as a potential case study for advanced aircraft control training. The techniques employed to maintain flight with severely degraded control authority demonstrate exceptional skill and may provide valuable insights for emergency procedure development. Translation: what Lyra did was so unusual, so technically demanding, that it should be studied and taught to other pilots. By the time she was released from medical that afternoon, wearing a sling and carrying a bottle of painkillers she had no intention of taking if she could avoid them, the base had transformed her into something between legend and curiosity. People stared as she walked past, some with open admiration, others with the uncertain look of those trying to reconcile the slight woman before them with the story they'd heard. She ignored them with practiced ease. Attention had always been something she neither sought nor welcomed. She flew because the mathematics of aviation made sense to her in ways human interaction often didn't, because the sky was a place where competence mattered more than personality. Becoming the center of whispered conversations and pointed looks made her deeply uncomfortable. Redline found her in the maintenance hangar, standing beside Viper 1-1, staring at the damage in daylight. The aircraft looked worse than it had in darkness, every scar and wound visible. Maintenance crews worked around it carefully, documenting everything, preparing it for transport to a re-echelon facility where specialists would decide if it could be repaired or if it would be stripped for parts. "How's the shoulder?" Redline asked quietly. "Functional." She reached up carefully, tested the range of motion, grimaced. "Flight surgeon says 6 weeks minimum before reassessment, maybe longer." They stood in silence, watching mechanics photograph the damaged engine. The finality of it settled over them both. 6 weeks in combat zones might as well be 6 years. Missions would continue, situations would evolve, the war would move on without waiting for her recovery. "They're talking about putting you in for a distinguished flying cross," Redline said. "Maybe even higher, Silver Star territory." Lyra's laugh was short and bitter. "For not crashing, for doing what I'm trained and paid to do. For doing it better than anyone thought possible." He gestured at the aircraft. "You kept this jet flying through damage that should have killed you. You protected ground forces, saved my ass, and brought back valuable intelligence about the SAM site's capabilities. That's not just doing your job, that's exceptional." She turned to face him, and her expression carried something he'd rarely seen, genuine emotion breaking through her usual calm detachment. "You want to know the truth? I was terrified. Every second from that hit until touchdown, I was certain the next moment would be the one where something else failed, where the math stopped working and the aircraft finally gave up. I wasn't brave. I was too scared to quit because quitting meant accepting I was going to die." "Bravery isn't the absence of fear," Redline said softly. "It's what you do despite being afraid." That's a nice sentiment for motivational posters. But her voice softened slightly. "Look, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but medals and commendations don't change the fact that I'm grounded for at least 6 weeks, maybe permanently if this shoulder doesn't heal right. I'm a pilot who can't fly. That's all that matters." She walked away before he could respond, leaving him standing beside the broken aircraft, wondering if exceptional skill was sometimes its own curse. If the ability to do something far beyond normal made it impossible to accept being reduced to normal afterward. In the command post, Major Reeves gathered his senior staff for a briefing. The mission investigation had expanded beyond simple after-action review into something more comprehensive, pulling in representatives from Air Combat Command, weapons system evaluation teams, and combat documentation units. Everyone wanted to understand what had happened, extract lessons, update procedures. But Reeves had a different concern. He pulled Lieutenant Colonel Marsh aside, speaking quietly while others reviewed data displays. "We need to talk about Captain Cowery." Marsh raised an eyebrow. "The investigation, she's clean. The data shows she did everything by the book, just exceptionally well." "Not the investigation, her state of mind." Reeves kept his voice low. "I've seen this before with pilots who have close calls. They process it differently. Some become more cautious, some become reckless, some shut down emotionally. She's walking around like nothing happened, but that aircraft should have been her coffin. Nobody processes that overnight." "You think she needs a psychological evaluation?" "I think she needs someone paying attention," Reeves said carefully. "She's not going to ask for help. She'll consider it weakness, will try to handle everything internally. But 6 weeks grounded is a long time for someone whose entire identity is built around flying. We need to keep eyes on her." Marsh nodded slowly, understanding the subtext. Combat aviation attracted certain personality types: driven, competitive, supremely confident in their abilities. But those same traits could make asking for help feel like failure. And failure was something pilots like Lyra didn't know how to accept. The sun set over the Syrian desert, painting everything gold and crimson. Another day in the war, another mission cycle complete. But something had shifted in the fundamental story the pilots told themselves about competence and courage. Dust wasn't just a call sign anymore. It had become shorthand for a moment when the impossible happened, when skill and determination had refused to yield to probability. In her quarters, Lyra sat on her bunk and carefully removed the sling. The flight surgeon had been clear. Keep it immobilized, let the stitches heal, don't stress the damaged tissue. But she needed to know. Needed to understand if her shoulder would recover enough to pass the physical requirements for combat flight status. So she lifted her arms slowly, testing range of motion, cataloging pain and weakness with clinical precision. 30 degrees before significant pain, 60 before she had to stop. Not good, not nearly enough. She lowered her arm carefully and stared at the wall where her flight gear hung. Helmet, G-suit, survival vest. Tools of her profession, suddenly as distant as artifacts in a museum. The possibility that she'd flown her last combat mission settled over her like dust, fine and pervasive, impossible to brush away. Her grandmother's voice echoed in memory. Dust settles but never disappears. Always finds new places to land, new cracks to infiltrate. Maybe that was true. Maybe this wasn't an ending but a transformation, a forced evolution into something else. But sitting alone in the gathering darkness, shoulder throbbing and future uncertain, it felt exactly like an ending. On the flight line, maintenance crews covered Viper 11 with tarps, protecting it from wind and sand while they waited for transport. The aircraft sat silent and dark, no longer a weapon but a monument. A physical reminder that sometimes survival required breaking, that coming home meant accepting damage, that the cost of making it through could be the very thing that defined you. The war would continue tomorrow. Missions would fly, targets would be struck, pilots would face danger with professional detachment. But tonight, the story everyone whispered was about the major who said it was over, and the A-10 that rose from the ashes anyway. About dust settling into new shapes. About refusing to disappear. The investigation took 3 days to complete its preliminary phase, during which Lyra existed in a strange limbo between hero and patient. Senior officers wanted to debrief her. Maintenance teams wanted technical details about control inputs and system failures. Intelligence analysts wanted information about the SAM site that had nearly killed her. She answered their questions with the same clinical precision she brought to flying, reducing terror and triumph to technical specifications. The SAM launch was from approximately grid November Whiskey 7342, she told the intelligence debrief. Single launch, radar